Good morning, and welcome to Quilt Documentation Day, sponsored by the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. My name is Jane Prisby, for those of you who haven't joined us before, and I am your host for today. And for today's theme, I decided that it was appropriate, given that November is Native American History Month, that we would talk today about quilts made by Native Americans or Native American quilt making traditions, specifically in the Southeast, because there's been a lot of scholarship about Plains Indian quilt makers, as well as other more West Coast quilt makers, but there's not a lot been written about or spoken about Southeastern Native American quilting traditions, and there's a good reason for that. And this I learned from Dr. William Morrow Goins, to whom I would like to dedicate today's program, because he unfortunately passed away about this time of year in 2017. He had been the chair of the McKissick Museum's Advisory Council and also the guest curator for a major year-long exhibition about Native American artists of the Southeastern United States. So what I learned from Will was that because so many tribal groups in the Eastern Seaboard had been, really decimated by disease with the arrival of Europeans, and then, of course, moved eventually in the early part of the 19th century, moved to the Midwest, the Cherokee in particular on the Trail of Tears, that in some cases, Eastern tribal groups, and especially Southeastern tribal groups, were only really relatively recently, and this was thanks in large part to the kind of granular research you can now do thanks to scanning of historical documents and newspapers, that in many cases, tribal groups here in the Southeast were really at the beginning of reconstructing their own traditions and histories from these earlier historical periods. So again, Dr. Goins was the former executive director of the Eastern Cherokee, Southern Iroquois, and the United Tribes of South Carolina. And again, a very passionate advocate for Native American history and traditions. He himself was an artist, a practitioner, and thanks to him, we have at the McKissick Museum a fairly small but substantial collection of artwork by Native American artists in the Southeastern United States. And again, today I want to thank especially his mom, Elsie Goins, was kind enough to allow me to really speak to her grandmother's quilts, her family's quilts, as well as her own, because for the exhibit that her son, Will Goins, guest curated here at the McKissick Museum, she created a special quilt that is now in our permanent collection. So, so again, without further ado, I want to thank Amanda too. Amanda is our communications manager at McKissick Museum, and she is the design behind the scenes person here today who will make sure that you see images of the quilts that I'm talking about. And I want to thank the South Carolina Arts Commission because we have a full life partnership grant with them that allows us and supports programs like this. And then apart from Elsie, who was so generous with allowing me to speak about her family's quilts, we have to thank Lynn Leslie for some images that help us contextualize Elsie's grandmother's life and work. So without further ado, could we have the first image, please? Okay, so I want to introduce you here to Elsie Taylor Goins. This is a picture of her at Folk Fabulous at the Fair in 2019, and she is standing next to a quilt by her grandmother, Amanda Stiegel Allen, who was born in 1874 and passed in 1961. And she was born in Easley, South Carolina, to Kate Ross and Spencer Stiegel. And it's fascinating for me, and you're going to hear today a lot of snippets of what I've been able to gather and glean from some very granular research about this family, but also from information that Elsie has been so generous in sharing with me. So again, this particular quilt is in a variation of a 9-patch actually, but it's a star pattern, and you'll see these colors, green, yellow, and purple. Please take note of the design, the colors in this particular quilt. It was made for Elsie's son, Wendell, and it was made in 1954. So this was made towards the end of Amanda Stiegel Allen's life, but a very, very nice example of a baby quilt. And we will come back to it a little later on. The next image, please. So again, in doing research on Cherokee quilt making traditions, it becomes very apparent very early that there is no documented, long-term tradition of quilt making among the Cherokee in the on the eastern seaboard in the southeast. But there is a very strong documented tradition of a fiber art tradition, which is the river cane mat and basket weaving traditions. So early Europeans who came to North America and traveled to what's now North Carolina, South Carolina, noted in their documentation of their experience of the lives and culture of the tribal groups they encountered. They were very specific in calling out the absolute mastery of these particular mats that were used as floor mats. So they were, these were mats that people sat on and welcomed guests on. So I thought it was really, really interesting that this mat in particular, Amanda, could I have the detail? Okay, you see this image in the middle? It just so happens to be the same pattern as the quilt pattern that Amanda Stiegel Allen used when she made the quilt for her great-grandson, Wendell. And so again, Elsie and I talked about this, and a discussion of the sort of tradition of the fiber art tradition within the Cherokee of the woven river cane mat and basket traditions is a whole other discussion that'll have to happen at another time. And it's one of those I talked about it as a rabbit hole. I mean, when I do research on these kinds of traditions, you realize that there's this fascinating sort of avenue to go down. And I thought, okay, at some point in my life, I will begin to look at how, again, you can easily imagine how the European women who first came to North America, would have encountered these mats and this design tradition, and may actually have been inspired to make quilt patterns in imitation of, borrowing from these very bold geometric patterns that the Native American women were creating using other woven fiber art materials. So I think that's, again, a topic. It's one of those rabbit hole topics that I would love to go down at some point, but not for today. The next image, please. So this is a portrait of Amanda Stiegel Allen. We think about 1900. So, and this was shared by the family. And you can see she's dressed in a very high style kind of dress. And she probably would have been living still in Seneca, South Carolina at this time. Her family, that's where she married and raised her family in Seneca, South Carolina. And it turns out her father, Spencer, was fairly, I would say a very, very successful farmer. The probate, when his will was probated, it was public knowledge in the newspaper, and I believe there were well over 400 acres that were part of his farm estate, and as well as the newspaper details the other kinds of things he had in his estate that were being probated. So she came, Amanda came from a successful family of farmers, and eventually she did work outside her home. She was working for a commandant at Clemson University as a cook, and her children played with the commandant's family's children as well. And again, they would have been a very, again, a prominent family in that community, a very well-known family in that community. Next image, please. Now, I'm going to move forward and then backward a little bit here, because in 1914, Amanda Stegall Allen and her family moved to Asheville. And this is called the Manor Inn that you see right here. And apparently, eventually, Amanda Stegall Allen got a job working here at the Manor Inn, which was pre-Grove Park Inn. So it was a very upscale resort where I am guessing, because I've read, again, articles in the newspaper from that time that talk about how at summer and winter hotels, there would be young women often sewing crazy quilts, for example, stitching, sitting at their leisure, making quilts. And so I am guessing that if Amanda Stegall Allen was working here, and a family oral history suggests that, you know, she met people like President Garfield's daughter, you know, so very affluent families came and stayed at the Manor Inn. There were cottages that were built on the property as well for them to stay for the summer months. And again, so she would have moved from Seneca to Asheville, and had her world probably expanded somewhat, because Asheville is a bigger place. Next image, please. Again, this is the dining room at the Manor Inn. So this is a space she would have moved through quite regularly. Next image. And this is the kitchen. And these images are from Lynn Leslie, because the Manor Inn has been renovated as apartments, but they did manage to keep the dining room, or they renovated the dining room and the kitchen per historic guidelines. And this would have been the kitchen that Amanda worked in. Next image, please. So by 1920 in Asheville, Amanda's family had purchased, I think, according to Elsie, torn down one house and then built this house, which is the one that Elsie remembers going to as a child. Her family, Elsie's family, was in DC, and in the summers, once her grandmother had retired, she and her siblings would go and spend the summer with grandma in Asheville at this home. Next picture, please. And this is an image of it from the back. So the porches on the back and the side porch is where Elsie remembers her grandmother going after the day's work was done. She would go to the side porch where she had a rocking chair, and she would crochet. During those summers, Elsie also remembers that her grandmother would have her and the other kids, you know, cut out quilting pieces, you know, so she'd give them a block and scissors, and they would cut out pieces to make quilts later, for her to make quilts later on. So Elsie has very fond memories of that. Next image, please. Okay, so this is a velvet quilt that Amanda Stegall Allen made. Again, it would not have been uncommon for Amanda to have encountered, you know, velvet quilts, silk quilts, crazy quilts while still in Seneca. I mean, when she was a girl, you know, the crazy quilt patchwork phase came in, and there was a lot in the local newspapers. And I found in the Oconee Fair, I forget which year it was, but it was in the 1890s. The Oconee Fair had already had a crazy quilt category in which you could win a prize. So, you know, there were women recognized for their crazy quilts at that fair. So, so Amanda would have had contact and knowledge of crazy quilt traditions. And this looks like a strip piece kind of version of that. Next image, please. This is a crazy quilt that Amanda Stegall Allen made, and I can't put a firm date on it, but it would be circa, you know, crazy quilts like this made out of silk scraps would have been made well into the 1920s. It was a popular, you know, pattern. Its heyday was in the 1880s, 1890s, but Amanda could easily have made this later into like 1910, 1920, something like that. Next image is a detail of it. Yeah, I don't know, you can't see, it's hard to see, but she did embroidery along the edges between the different pieces of quilt. So there's beautiful embroidery. So she was clearly a very skilled needle artist. Next image, please. So again, like some of the quilters that we've talked about in other programs, earlier programs, for whom we have a body of work to look at, right? So it's not normal that you have a chance to see a whole body of work by one particular quilt artist. But in this case, we have, again, the opportunity to see that. And like with other quilters that we've had a chance to look at a body of work, Amanda Stiegel-Allen made all kinds of quilts over the course of her life, right? So she didn't just make a velvet quilt. She didn't just make crazy quilts. You know, she didn't just make scrap quilts. She made pieces like this. So this particular quilt, again, Elsie doesn't remember her grandmother ever using a commercial pattern, which doesn't mean she didn't see things that were made from commercial patterns, but she herself, you know, Amanda, and then later on even Elsie would adapt that and create their own versions of it, you know, because they were skilled needleworkers. So this particular tulip pattern looks a lot like a published pattern from 1935-ish. But again, you remember Wendells quilt had the green, yellow, and purple color scheme. Well, those are very, very classic, you know, complementary color schemes, and Amanda chose to make this quilt also in those three colors. So she had a keen sense of color and used that repeatedly in her pieces, and becomes, those colors I think become something of a signature for her. So this is cotton, and she went to the trouble of, after appliquing the tulips onto the ground, she did black outline embroidery in order to highlight the, you know, to kind of outline the design. And it's just lovely. It's very minimalist. It's just really lovely, quiet quilt. Next image, please. This is probably my favorite because it's a classic wedding ring quilt, but again, not classic in the choice of colors. So you see again, the purple, the yellow, and a smattering of green, of course, other colors as well, but you get a real sense of the dynamism of her color sensibility. Using up scraps. Again, this is a pattern that was very, very popular in the 30s, 40s. I mean, it continues to be made, right? It's a very popular pattern, but yeah, this is probably among my favorite of those that she made, and it's meticulously quilted. I mean, it's hand quilted. It's just really, really beautiful when you get close up to it. Next image, please. Okay, here is Wendells quilt again. I documented this when I was at Elsie's home, looking at the quilts that she had in her family for possible exhibition, and so here we come back to it. Here's Wendells baby quilt in 1954. Next image, please. Okay, so this is also in Elsie's, it's in her possession, right? She is, you know, many families have one person who cares about the family history and becomes kind of the keeper of the family legacy. And I would say that Elsie Goins has taken on that role in her family. And when I was at her home documenting her grandmother's quilts that her grandmother had made, she showed me this one as well. And this one, had a little card attached to it that said it was by Corey Allen Sisney, who was born in 1892, passed away in 1987, and she was one of Amanda's daughters. So, so Amanda passed on her needlework skills to her daughters. Elsie's mom was famous for making Dutch doll quilts for her grandchildren, and then this is a mosaic style quilt in the Field of Diamonds pattern that, again, very popular in the 1930s, 1940s, and Elsie's aunt did a beautiful job with this. Elsie's aunt, as her mother, were college graduates, which when I did a little poking around, I think Amanda's husband was a teacher. And so their family clearly valued education, hence their children went to college, you know, their grandchildren went to college, you know, Will earned his PhD. So again, these quilts, this quilt by Elsie's aunt, was made, while she was working full time in DC for Parks and Rec and doing a lot of work with a Lutheran church. She was very involved with one of the women's societies associated with the church. And I found a notice that she was scheduled to give a talk on the role of women in heathen countries. So she was clearly attuned to women's issues. And something that I haven't said anything about yet today, but that I think is important to note, is that both within the Cherokee tribal culture history as well as the Seminole, those are both matrilineal. Historically, we're matrilineal peoples. So the children were born into the mother's family, whereas in most European cultures, it's a patriarchal kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kinship organization, where children are born into the father's clan or father's home. In Seminole and in Cherokee communities, the children were born into the mother's clan. So I think that that may account for some of how empowered these women were. And I just wanted to mention that as something to consider in thinking about the history of these fiber art traditions in these tribal groups in the southeastern United States. Next image, please. Okay, so this is a wall hanging in the collection of the McKissick Museum that Elsie Goins made herself. And I think it's really interesting how her mother had really, and this resonated with me because my Polish grandmother loved the Dutch doll quilt pattern, right? And she made many quilts using that pattern. She just had a great affection for it. It was a really popular pattern from, the late 19th century on till today. People make Dutch girl applique quilts. And what Elsie did, because again, sometimes your self awareness and wanting to self-identify with a particular part of your past and culture, it skips generations. And I would suggest that Elsie here, rather than make it the Dutch girl, had created her own pattern for a Native American Cherokee girl, and so created this wall hanging. And she's also created quilts in her own family, for her own family, in which she did the Native American Cherokee boys and girls. So I think that's really, really interesting that her mom was really attached to the Dutch girl pattern, and now she's created her own Cherokee pattern. Next image, please. And I just wanted to show you a detail of this because I think it'll be interesting when we get to talking about the Seminole, because of the way in which the horizontal bands in the skirts become such a signature within the Seminole patchwork tradition. And I just wanted to show you too just the level of detail that Elsie put into this. Elsie is clearly a very skilled needle artist in and of herself. Next image, please. This is a doll, a Cherokee doll, that one of a number that are in the museum's collection that Elsie created once she relocated from Washington, D.C. down to South Carolina. She would create these Cherokee dolls, and her son Will, according to her, would take some of them and take them to a museum in Pickens County and put them up for sale. So it was entrepreneurship and as well as artistry here that led to these particular dolls. Next image, please. I would say this is one of Elsie's more recent, really, really ambitious projects that we are fortunate at the McKissick Museum to have in our permanent collection right now, because when her son curated this major exhibition of Native artists of the Southeast, we commissioned Elsie Goins to create this special quilt. And what she chose to do was to document the logos of the Native American tribal groups here in South Carolina. And you'll see there are any number of them. And I don't know, again, if you see the kind of repetition of a kind of well, actually, you won't see this until the next part our program. But this idea of juxtaposing the circular patterns with the grid, I think is a kind of a signature that does emerge over time within Southeastern Native American tribal groups. So I think this piece is just absolutely stunning. It contains a lot of hand stitching. I mean, it's all handmade and all original design. So I mean, she would look at the materials from the different tribal groups and take their logo, and if they didn't have one, she would create one. So so this particular piece, like I said, is really masterful, and includes beadwork as well. So she pulled out the stops and really brought all of her needle art skills to the making of this particular quilt. Next image, please. You'll see that she actually, in the quilting, and it's hard to see because of how tiny it is and expertly it's done, but she put animals. She quilted animals into the quilt. So she did it with the quilting, not with the applique. So she pays tributes to animals that are important in their tribal culture. I think this looks like a wolf head. Next one. I believe this is a bear, perhaps. Next one. Okay, could you go back just to the previous one, Amanda, please? So before we leave, you know, a discussion of Cherokee quilt making traditions, I just wanted to say that that I have been very intrigued about future directions for research in this area, because like I said before, there's no real evidence of a long time Cherokee quilt making tradition. Although the April 1st, 1963 article in the Fort Apache Scout from White River, Arizona mentions, and I quote, the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina boasts 2 factories that where moccasins and Indian quilts are turned out by machine. These plants, which employ about 200 Indians, are owned by white businessmen attracted to the reservation by Cherokee financial assistance in construction costs and freedom from property taxes. So what in the world those particular quilts looked like, or who designed them, or where the designs came from and how they were marketed by clearly these white businessmen, I have no idea, but I would be very interested to find out. And I think the larger story here is that of Cherokee entrepreneurship that that has most recently been documented by a faculty member at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Courtney Lewis, in 2019, published a book titled Sovereign Entrepreneurs, Cherokee Small Business Owners and the Making of Economic Sovereignty. So for those of you who are interested in Cherokee entrepreneurship, and certainly I am, and I will be reading these things more closely and doing some follow-up research, but I'm just intrigued by how that worked with you know, Indian quilts being produced by Cherokee in factories owned by white men interested in economic development, but also supported by Cherokee financial assistance in construction costs. So again, life is complicated. I'm guessing this is a complicated story, but not to detract from the story of the quilts in Elsie Goins' family. Thank you, Elsie, again, for sharing the story of your grandmother and your aunt and your own quilts with me and with us. The story of her family is one where, again, the women were very much a part of the larger culture. You know, they were fashionable. They followed fashion trends they were aware of, and part of the larger, you know, participating in the larger popular culture. And then more recently within Elsie's generation, and then certainly with her son, Dr. Will Moreau Goins, using and adapting these traditions in their own families and bringing them more closely aligned with a Cherokee Native American cultural identity. So thank you very much, Elsie Goins. So the next section of my talk today is about the Lumbee. And the way in which they have, in really recent times, identified a particular quilt block with their own tribal culture. Next image, please. So in the latter part of the 19th century, this is an image of Maggie Lowry Locklear, and she lived from 1868 to 1931. And within the Lumbee in North Carolina, she is known for having made in the late 19th century this amazing quilt that we now call the pine cone or pine burr quilt pattern. Next image, please. Okay, looks kind of like target practice, right? I mean, this is a very difficult three-dimensional quilt block pattern that very few people take on because it is so incredibly ambitious and complicated. And as the story goes, Maggie Locklear created this from pants that her husband wore mostly. She had 3 husbands apparently, and so she had lots of pants to use up, and she used it to create this quilt. Of course, the longleaf pine forests of longleaf pine were in North Carolina. Those forests have been somewhat endangered across the southeastern United States, but it lives on in this quilt design pattern. And apparently, many people tried to buy this quilt from Maggie Locklear, and she refused to sell it. So it is now on view in the exact name. I think it's the Southeastern Museum of Native Americans. That's part of the Lumbee Tribal Organization. So in North Carolina. So it's on permanent display there. You can still see it. And what happened was in the 1990s, Mr. Hayes Allen Locklear decided that he would take this block pattern. Next image, please. So these are examples of the pine burr or pine cone block. Next image, if you can see the detail. So it requires a folding technique, and it's very three-dimensional, and it's supposed to resemble the bottom part of a pine cone. You can see, you know, the little three-dimensional pine cone pieces in there. So what Hayes Allen Locklear did was he designed a dress for Natasha Wagner, who in 1993 won the Miss Indian World contest wearing a dress with this particular pine cone, pine burr block on the dress. Next image, please. And so since that time, the Lumbee have really self-identified the quilt block pattern of the pine burr, pine cone with Lumbee culture. And that seems to be something that is continuing. Interestingly enough, this pattern also has become associated with the Gee's Bend quilters of Alabama. And Alabama has declared the pine cone, pine burr block quilt pattern as their state pattern. So in honor of the Gee's Bend quilters. So within both native Southeastern American cultures as well as in the African American communities in the Southeast, this particular pattern has acquired resonance and meaning for them. And I think it's amazing how, again, you can see in the regalia that these Lumbee princesses are wearing, you can see the influence of the Seminole patchwork, but also, again, on the bodice, you have the pine burr pattern, the circle within the geometry. So that's the same thing we saw in the quilt that Elsie Goins made for the exhibit at McKissick Museum. You have the circular sort of patterning with and embedded in a geometric kind of framework. Next image, please. So again, the last part of our talk today will be focused on the Seminole patchwork tradition, because historically, many of the Native Americans across the United States, or what became the United States, learned how to sew from missionaries. And I'm thinking especially the Seminole, and then also in Hawaii. Missionaries traveled there, and they taught through the Native American schools, but also just in the communities, in the churches. They would teach the women how to sew And sewing was supposed to be part of, civilizing the natives, right? So it was seen as something that, again, European women did, and this would help, native groups acclimate to a more European kind of culture. Well, in truth, what many Native American women did when they learned how to sew was that skill building they put to their own uses, their own cultural uses. And this is really most prominent within the Seminole Indian culture. So again, they learned how to sew from missionaries. Seminole women learned, and then they created, or they embellished what they had traditionally been wearing as dress. So early 19th century descriptions of Seminole women's dress is of fairly plain skirt, blouse. By the 1920s, you get descriptions in newspapers that they are making skirts now that are using much more fabric than anybody should, right? 20 some yards of fabric to make these skirts that have very bright, and the word they used oftentimes was gaudy, right? Gaudy striped colored fabrics to make these skirts that both they and also the men, so Seminole men began wearing these skirts as well with wide horizontal stripes, and then also jackets. So the Seminole women essentially, recreated their traditional dress using the skills that they had acquired. And then, of course, here you see this young girl with a Singer sewing machine. So they were incredibly entrepreneurial in terms of, again, learning how to use the sewing machine for their own uses, but then also for economic development within the Seminole economy. So, for better and for worse, there were Seminole villages that were recreated in Florida for a period of time that were tourist attractions. And so the women would make dolls, they would make, Seminole-like clothing that tourists could purchase as a memento of their experience of the Seminole Indian culture. So next image, please. Here you see, again, this is supposedly this postcard is from the 1930s, but I think it might be a little earlier because again, the stripes are, there's no patchwork on this, right? So it's just horizontal stripes of fabric, contrasting colors, that are made for both the men and for the women. So the men and the women are wearing skirts, and as well as a form of regalia on the top as well. Next image, please. So again, Seminole Nation holds Mother's Day in Miami, Florida. So again, I think this is probably one of the postcards that were created to sell at the Seminole Indian Village in Miami. And you see here, the skirts have become much more elaborate in terms of patchwork. So they took the patchwork tradition that European women were using to make quilts, and they embedded rows of patchwork in their skirts. Next image, please. Okay, so by the 1950s, you have, and it's not clear, and this is another research project that is waiting to happen. So I found this image of a 1950s Seminole patchwork dress, which was clearly created for a fashion, sort of for a European woman to perhaps wear. And I found two of these, and one of them has a label in it that suggests that this was designed and made by a Seminole woman, but I have not been able to confirm that yet, so I don't want to put that out there. But I think it's really, really interesting that this patchwork tradition that the Seminole women created for their own regalia then makes its way into European summer wear in Florida, right? Here in the form of this 1950s very, very posh kind of dress with the waist, cinched waist. It's not two pieces, but clearly incorporating the Seminole patchwork as part of the skirt. Next image, please. So flash forward. This is the summer 2020 fashion line, summer fashion line that designer Ulla Johnson put out. There's this image. You see the stripes and the patchwork in the bodice. Next image. Again, the horizontal stripes. Next image. Horizontal stripes. Next image. Patchwork with horizontal stripes. Next image. Patchwork with horizontal stripes. Next image. So Ulla Johnson got quite a bit of pushback from the Seminole women who are making traditional Seminole patchwork in Florida. They contacted her and said that they felt that her use of their, her inspiration from Seminole patchwork was a form of cultural appropriation. Ulla Johnson's staff came back and said they had actually tried to contact them to perhaps hire the Seminole women as seamstresses and hadn't heard back. Where the truth lies, I have no idea at this point. But I wanted to end today's program with an image here of these two Seminole women wearing Seminole dress, contemporary one. This is an image from February 2020 magazine cover. The woman on the left seated is Cheyenne Kippenberger, and she's wearing traditional Seminole dress made by late Seminole patchwork artist Donna Turtle. And the woman on the right is named Thomasina Hoopo Gillian, and she's wearing a dress that was designed by Seminole designer Simply Savage Steps. So I just wanted to, again, end this conversation about the Seminole patchwork tradition, showing you that within the Seminole culture, this tradition is still evolving, very much alive, and a counter to or a partner with the designers like Ulla Johnson, who are doing lines that are quote unquote inspired by Seminole patchwork traditions. I'm fascinated by the back and forth, you know, in design, because I think we all borrow from what we see, right? And depending on what the power relationships are there, sometimes it does strike of cultural appropriation, but sometimes it can be honoring, sometimes it can be something in between. But I feel like the Seminole women need to have the last voice here, because in so many cases, the history of Native American culture in the United States, the Native American voice has not been front and forward and foremost. So I wanted to end today's program with this image of these women, these Seminole women, and thank you very much for participating and joining us for our Quilt Documentation Day here in South Carolina, McKissick Museum, University of South Carolina. Again, we were going to end with this image of Dr. William Morrow Goins, because, you know, historically, Will would do a Native American Film Festival in November, and we always try to participate in that and support him in that. And I feel like today's program, again, is in his honor for all that he taught me and has taught us about how much work there is to do in studying and interpreting Native American art, culture, history of the Southeastern United States. If anybody has any questions, please type them in. My Amanda Ballou, my communications manager, will share those with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions I have any answers to. I am not an expert in Native American quilt making traditions or Native American history, but I am someone who really cares about that history and am committed to ensuring that at the McKissick Museum that history is documented and celebrated. So I'll wait a minute to see whether any of you have any questions here. Okay, well, again, I will close by saying again, I am wearing patchwork, right? A patchwork vest that, when I was working on this program, it occurred to me that really the whole wearable patchwork tradition that in my previous program, I talked about it being sort of starting in the 1960s, coming out of the civil rights movement and a co-op in Appalachia. Really, the Seminole may have been the start of it all. And so our wearable art, the wearable patchwork may have been the real pioneers. So thank you all for your thank yous. And I look forward to seeing you next month. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.